who ultimately created a peace process between Israel and Egypt. These two countries that had fought, remember, 3 wars against each other. Um, Israel at this point now has a peace process. Remember, the wars between the Arab countries and Israel in 48, 67, 73 were between Israel and Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. And currently, thanks to the work of previous presidents, both Egypt and Jordan have peace treaties with Israel. So they are at total peace. Egypt and Jordan are actually allies of Israel. Syria, not yet. Syria is still kind of out in the cold, but from what everybody in the foreign policy establishment will tell you, that's not going to last much longer. In fact, President Obama just recently re-engaged Syria, sent a new diplomat over there in the hopes, in the process of bringing a peace deal between Syria and Israel. So it could very well be that by the end of 2010, by the end of this year, these 4 nations that have fought, actually not 3 wars, 4 wars against each other, could be completely at peace. There's just sort of one nation left, Syria, for that puzzle to be complete. And yet, despite all of that, there has been almost zero, zero positive outcome between peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And when President Obama came to power, the first thing that he promised to do was to reverse previous President Bush's absolutely appalling work in this process. You probably don't remember, but 8 years ago when President Bush came to power, he actually had a completely different view of this conflict than every other president who had come before him. President Bush's point was, this isn't really our problem. This is a problem between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and they should work it out on their own. And so essentially what Bush did was just kind of wipe his hands clean of the entire mess. Now, let's be honest for a moment. First of all, Bush didn't really wipe his hands clean. As a matter of fact, he had a very simple policy for 8 years. That policy was Israel can do whatever it wants to do, whenever it wants to do it, to whomever it wants to do it. It's a very simple policy on Bush's part. Israel, right or wrong, that was Bush's policy for 8 years. Part of that policy, however, was this notion that, hey, this is a peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, so let's have the Israelis and the Palestinians deal with it. Right? Except that this is not actually 2 equal groups. It's not as though the Israelis and the Palestinians are equal partners. It's not as though they're sitting at the table, with equal power. One, Israel, is first of all a state, a nation state. It's also the richest nation in the Middle East. It's also the most powerful nation in the Middle East. It has the largest army. It has a weapon system that's almost equal to the United States weapon system. Why? Because it's our weapons. And also, it's not a third world country. In fact, the per capita income, in other words, per person income in Israel is larger than the combined per person income of every other country in the Middle East combined. So you're talking about a first world country, not a third world country, powerful, wealthy, democratic first world country. On the other side, you have a non-state. There's no Palestine. There's no Palestinian government. There's sort of a provisional, a nominal head, the Palestinian Authority, as it's referred to, which is essentially, the political voice of the Palestinians, but they have no recognition. It's not like they have a seat at the UN. They don't get to vote for anything. And certainly, so that's politically speaking, certainly economically speaking, what remains of Palestine is one of the poorest places on earth. The West Bank is doing a little bit better, but the Gaza Strip, remember that little strip of land in the Gaza, is one of the poorest, most earth. It is, to this day, the most densely packed region on the planet. 1.5 million people in a space that is little more than just a gigantic prison. No food gets in, no food gets out. It has maybe a couple of hours of electricity a day, no real sense of any kind of potable water. Everything that it uses to survive is brought in by Israel through that little thing. And I told you, I gave you the metaphor of saying, because again, Gaza is no longer directly occupied territory. About 3 or 4 years ago, the Israelis decided to withdraw from Gaza, so they don't really call it occupied territory anymore. But we've talked about this, right? It's a silly distinction. I mean, if you're occupying this classroom and then you walk out of the classroom and just go to the doors, you're still occupying us, even though you're not in the actual room. You've basically become, prison wardens. That's really what you've become. So to think that these two sides can sit down at a table by themselves without an intermediary and hash out a peace plan is ridiculous. It's absurd. It's like the difference between it's like a parent and a child negotiating something. There's no negotiation. Whatever the parent wants, the parent gets. The parent is the bigger, the stronger, the more powerful. The parent pays the bills. The parent says no, it's no. There's nothing to talk about. Unless, of course, there is sort of a mediator there, a third group, a third person who can actually deal with two sides in some sort of equal fashion. And for most of the last 40 years or so, that intermediary was the United States, except for the Bush administration. It was 8 years of the Bush administration. When President Obama came to office, he decided that he was going to do things differently. In fact, he made a number of grand promises